Can Moses and Aaron's obedience change the fate of an entire nation? One wrong decision could lead to catastrophic consequences, but can they overcome it? Moses and Aaron were ready to face gods and challenges like never before. Their journey will lead us to one of the most pivotal moments in history. Stay tuned to see how this challenge will change everything. The story of Moses and Aaron is not just a fairy tale. It's a journey full of trials, guided by God's call. They were chosen to lead the Israelites, but the road ahead would not be easy. For hundreds of years, the Israelites lived under slavery. Now, they stand before a chance at freedom. But before they could reach freedom, they would face a series of terrifying challenges. One of them was the plague that was about to unfold. What will happen when a judgment falls upon them? Moses and Aaron will have to make crucial decisions to save their people. Their story is not just a battle between man and God. It's a fight between freedom and slavery, life and death. And in this battle, no one could predict the outcome. But one thing is certain: the showdown between Moses, Aaron, and Pharaoh will change everything. Get ready to witness an event that will change the fate of an entire nation. Stay with us as we uncover the difficult journey of Moses and Aaron and the devastating event they must face. Moses and Aaron embarked on a journey, not only to lead the Israelites, but to fulfill God's will. Every step was full of hardship, facing the harshness of nature and doubts within themselves. Would they have the strength to do what God asked? And would the Israelites trust their leadership? In these difficult moments, Moses and Aaron held firmly to God's promises, even though they didn't know what lay ahead. Facing Pharaoh, they knew what was coming wasn't just a confrontation between two men. It was a battle of faith. Pharaoh, with his arrogance, would not easily yield, but Moses and Aaron could not turn back. With a declaration of defiance, Pharaoh refused to release the Israelites. But Moses knew they could not let this stop them. "My God has said, 'Let my people go,'" Moses said to Pharaoh, but Pharaoh responded with stubbornness. They understood this trial wouldn't be easy, but they were mentally prepared to face Pharaoh's wrath. It seemed as though nature was reacting as the signs of impending judgment began to show. They faced their people, waiting for deliverance. But they didn't know that judgment would come swiftly. Moses prayed, seeking guidance from God, knowing that nothing could happen without his help. A sign from God. The judgment had been issued, and everything was about to change. Moses and Aaron stood before Pharaoh again, but this time they carried more courage and faith than ever before. Pharaoh was angry, but this time he could not stop God's plan. Moses did what God told him. He prepared for the judgment. With a single word, the plague began. Rain fell, earthquakes struck, and the Egyptians began to feel God's wrath. Moses realized that God's word had come to pass, and he must act on it immediately. The Israelites saw the sign from heaven, but they did not know what would come next. Pharaoh, despite seeing the signs, still refused to yield. He challenged God's power. "Let my people go, or a great disaster will fall upon your land," Moses warned. But Pharaoh held firm, refusing to accept Moses' warning. Moses and Aaron understood that they were facing a great trial, and every decision they made would have far-reaching consequences. And then, as an undeniable sign, the storm came. Rain poured, thunder rumbled, and the land began to change. The Egyptians ran in panic, but all their efforts were in vain, as God's wrath could not be avoided. Moses and Aaron stood firm, trusting in God's word, without the slightest hesitation. The disaster began. The rain poured endlessly. Floodwaters rose, threatening all of Egypt. With each passing minute, the situation worsened. There was no safe place in all of Egypt. Moses continued to pray, knowing that this was only the beginning and the judgment was far from over. Pharaoh, finally realizing he could not fight against God's power, began to tremble in fear. The Egyptians began to cry out as God's judgment had become unbearable. But Moses could not stop. He knew that this judgment was necessary for the Israelites to be freed. Gradually, signs of the end began to appear. God's wrath started to subside. Pharaoh, after all, finally realized that God's power was undeniable, and he begged for mercy. Moses and Aaron, having faced many trials, continued on the path God had set for them. The Israelites stood waiting, hoping for the deliverance that Moses and Aaron had promised. Egypt was covered in darkness, not only due to the judgment, but also because of the despair spreading through the people. Moses and Aaron felt that God's wrath had reached its peak, and they needed to continue standing strong. The disaster grew worse as livestock died, and loss continued to spread throughout Egypt. The Egyptians fell to their knees, begging Pharaoh to intervene, but he could do nothing to save his land. Pharaoh, in his desperation, realized that his power could not compare to God's power. Moses prayed, fully aware that this judgment was necessary, though he did not wish for the Egyptians to suffer. In the midst of the storm, a light from heaven shone down as a sign that the judgment was nearing its end. Moses and Aaron stood before the Israelites, ready to receive God's guidance and lead their people out of slavery. "Our God is almighty," Moses declared, with firm belief that God would deliver his people. God's wrath began to subside, and everything slowly returned to peace. Pharaoh, now fully aware of God's absolute power, finally admitted his defeat. "Pray to God for me," Pharaoh cried out in despair. Moses, with compassion, prayed for Pharaoh, asking God to forgive and calm the judgment. As Moses prayed, the sky brightened and signs of forgiveness began to appear. The Egyptians began to realize that God's judgment could end if they turned back to him. Moses and Aaron understood that though forgiveness had come, the journey of deliverance was still long. The Israelites stood waiting for deliverance, knowing that salvation was near. God's wrath subsided, and Egypt slowly began to recover. Though they had suffered, the Egyptians realized that change and peace could only come from God. The Egyptians were still in chaos, unable to believe what was happening, as if the end of the world was near. Moses, not just a leader, but a guide in the darkest of times. Aaron couldn't avoid the feeling of anxiety, but his faith in God kept him from retreating. The Israelites were ready to walk, unsure of what the future held, but believing that deliverance was near. The sky slowly brightened, and the change in the atmosphere became clear, signaling the end of the disaster. The Israelites were no longer afraid. They stood waiting for the final guidance from Moses and Aaron. Moses looked up to the heavens, his heart full of gratitude and hope, praying that God would complete the work of salvation. Suddenly, the Red Sea began to rise like a massive wall, and everyone realized that deliverance was coming. The Israelites began to walk through the sea, filled with awe, but also with faith in God's miracle. The waters still crashed against the walls of the sea, as if proving God's mighty power. Pharaoh, seeing the Red Sea split in two, could not believe his eyes, fear rising within him. With his army, Pharaoh decided to pursue, even though he knew they were heading into an unforeseen danger. The Red Sea began to close, and everything that had happened suddenly felt like a distant nightmare. The Egyptian army was swept away by the waves, and no one could escape God's wrath. Moses looked towards the sea, unable to believe the miracle God had given to his people. The Israelites stood by the sea, filled with gratitude and worship, fully aware of God's absolute power. The Red Sea suddenly closed, and the Egyptian army was swept away by the waves, losing all hope. Moses looked towards the sea, where the Egyptian soldiers had been swept away, and God's judgment was fulfilled. The Israelites stood still, unable to believe their eyes. Salvation had truly come, and the miracle had been performed. All the Israelites fell to their knees, thanking God for this great deliverance. Moses raised his hands to the sky, thanking God for keeping his promise and delivering the people from bondage. Pharaoh, who once boasted of his unmatched power, now lay in total defeat, unable to change his fate. The Egyptian army was no more, their bodies floating on the surface of the water, a testament to God's judgment. The Israelites sang out loud, their praise for God echoing across the land, thanking him for the great deliverance. Moses, leading the way, looked ahead towards the promised land that God had promised to his people. A light from heaven shone down as a clear sign that God was with the Israelites, guiding them into the future. The Israelites did not look back. They only looked forward, where the promised land awaited them. The Egyptians now realized that they had completely failed and could not escape God's judgment. Pharaoh stood alone, facing the isolation and pain of defeat, no longer a king, but a loser. The Israelites could not contain their joy. They danced and sang, thanking God for the miraculous deliverance. They praised God because he had saved them from the hands of their enemies, and they would forever remember this in their hearts. Moses looked towards the promised land, his heart filled with hope and faith in God. A brilliant light shone from the heavens, signaling peace and prosperity would come to the Israelites. The Israelites entered the desert with firm belief in God's promise, knowing that the future awaited them. The light from heaven faded, but the hearts of the Israelites would never fade, for they had witnessed God's great power. The Israelites stood by the sea, light from heaven shining down, their hearts full of faith and gratitude. Moses knelt down, his heart overflowing with gratitude and a deep awareness of God's power. Aaron stood beside Moses, both of them praying, feeling God's powerful presence in every moment. The Red Sea slowly calmed, the waves gently lapping at the shore as a sign of peace after the storm. The Israelites began to sing a victory song, their praise echoing across the heavens and earth, thanking God for the miraculous salvation. The light from heaven continued to shine down as a confirmation from God of his protection and guidance for Israel's future. The Israelites along the shore not only felt safe, but also filled with pride for what they had overcome. Moses looked towards the promised land, his eyes full of resolve, knowing that God's work would continue to lead them. Moses stood before the Israelites, saying that although the road ahead was full of challenges, God would always be with them. Moses waved his hand, calling everyone together, reminding them that they were not just the saved, but witnesses of God's great power. The Israelites gathered around, listening intently to Moses, deeply aware that salvation was a grace they could never forget. The light from heaven grew stronger, as if God was entrusting Moses with the mission of leading the people into the future. Moses and the Israelites continued their journey, each step carried with unwavering faith in God's guidance. Moses led the way, each step a firm affirmation that God would never abandon his people. The Israelites once again beat as one, their hearts full of faith in the future that God had promised. The light from heaven slowly faded, but the promised land remained in sight as a promise that could not fade. The Israelites moved forward, each step a confirmation of hope and trust in God's promise. Moses paused, turned to look at the Israelites, his heart full of gratitude and belief in the future. The final light faded, but the faith in the hearts of the Israelites never dimmed. They continued their journey, heading towards the promised land. Moses stood on the hilltop, looking far ahead, where the promised land awaited. Everything now seemed clearer than ever. The light from heaven shone down onto the earth again, as if reminding Moses that God's guidance would always be present. The Israelites continued to follow Moses, their steps stronger than ever, their hearts filled with hope and certainty in God's promise. Moses looked back at Egypt, the place where they had been enslaved for so many years. Now, with this deliverance, they were completely free. The Israelites sang and danced, their hearts overflowing with gratitude. Their salvation was not only physical, but a liberation of their souls. Moses raised his hands to the sky, thanking God for performing this great miracle and delivering them from Egypt's oppression. The light faded, but the Israelites stepped into the desert with unwavering faith, knowing they would be led to a place of peace. Moses and the Israelites stood before the vast desert, seeing nothing but sand and stone, but their hearts were full of faith in God. A cloud from heaven covered them, guiding their path. Every step they took was under God's presence, protecting and showing the way. The Israelites moved forward, their eyes shining with hope and a longing for a promising future. Moses looked up to the sky, feeling God's strong presence, knowing that he was always beside his people. The Israelites continued to walk, their faith in God never fading, knowing they were never alone. Moses and the Israelites looked ahead, their hearts full of hope and trust in God's guidance, knowing the promised land awaited them. At night, the cloud continued to guide them. God's presence never left, watching over every step they took. The Israelites gathered together, sharing hope and determination. They knew that even though the road was difficult, they would make it to the end. Moses stood, looking ahead, his eyes filled with resolve. He knew that they had overcome the greatest challenge, and now only the journey ahead remained. Moses looked ahead, where the promised land awaited, vast fields and towering mountains, yet the road was still long. The Israelites walked under the dim light of evening, but none felt fear, for they knew God was always leading them. The cloud from heaven still covered and guided them, never leaving the Israelites. They believed God would protect them at all times, everywhere. Moses stood with the Israelites, looking ahead, his heart filled with hope. Though challenges awaited, their faith was unwavering. The light from the cloud shone down, continuing to guide them. The Israelites walked with absolute faith in God's promise. The Israelites continued looking toward the promised land, their eyes never leaving what awaited them ahead. God would lead them to a safe place. Moses led the way, his hand raised high, symbolizing the leadership and power that God had entrusted to him. Each step was a sign of unwavering faith. The Israelites continued their journey, never stopping, even though great difficulties lay ahead. They knew God's guidance was enough to overcome every challenge. The cloud covered and protected the Israelites from the heat and storms, a reminder that God would always protect them. no matter the circumstances. Moses looked ahead, his eyes bright with faith in a bright future, where the Israelites would live in freedom and peace. The light from heaven brightened, shining down on the path the Israelites were walking. God was always present, watching over and protecting every step they took. The Israelites felt deep comfort from God's presence, knowing that they would never face a challenge alone. The Israelites continued following the trail of the cloud and light, each step filled with faith in God's guidance. Moses stood with the Israelites, looking toward the promised land, seeing a bright future that God had promised them. The final light faded, but the Israelites did not fear. They knew that even though they could no longer see the light clearly, God was still leading them. The Israelites continued their journey in the darkness, but every step they took was filled with faith and hope in God's guidance. Moses turned to look at the Israelites one last time, his heart full of gratitude and faith in the future. They had overcome their greatest challenge, and now a new journey awaited. Moses stood before the Israelites, looking ahead, where the sunlight illuminated the towering mountains. The Israelites continued their journey, each step more confident, for they had overcome their greatest challenge, and now their faith was stronger than ever. The cloud still covered and protected the Israelites, a clear sign of God's ongoing presence in every step they took. Moses turned around and spoke to the Israelites. God has led us through this trial. We are not alone. He is always with us. Moses led the Israelites, his hand raised high, symbolizing the firm strength of his faith. The Israelites followed him with loyalty. The light from God shone down on the path ahead, a reminder of the bright future he had promised to the Israelites. The Israelites paused for a moment, looking at one another, their hearts filled with gratitude for the guidance and protection God had provided. Moses encouraged the Israelites, "Do not be afraid. God has led us through the sea, and he will lead us through every remaining difficulty." The Israelites continued their journey, walking in the light, walking in hope for the promises God had made. The surrounding landscape began to change, the land growing fertile, a sign of the blessings God was about to bestow upon the Israelites. Moses silently thanked God, knowing that he had not abandoned the Israelites despite the trials they had faced. He knew that this journey would never be easy, but God would always be with them. The Israelites took a moment to rest, their hearts filled with peace. They felt God's presence in every place they passed. Moses knelt down, hands raised to heaven, thanking God for the blessings he had given the Israelites. He knew that, though many trials lay ahead, their faith in God would be an invaluable strength. The Israelites continued their journey in unity, their hearts filled with faith in God's guidance. They knew that no matter how difficult things got, they would overcome. Now, the promised land was no longer far away. The scenery around them grew more beautiful, as a confirmation from God of a bright future for the Israelites. Moses looked back, a gentle smile appearing on his face. He knew that, though the road was long, God would always guide the Israelites to safety. The surroundings began to change. Trees started to sprout, and the land grew fertile, signaling God's blessings. The Israelites paused and looked at the lush fields around them. They felt God's love and care surrounding them. Moses turned around and said, "We have passed through this trial, but God will continue to lead us. Trust in him, for he will never leave us." The Israelites continued their journey, hand in hand, walking in unity and faith in God's guidance. As night fell, Moses lit a small lamp, preparing for a peaceful night of rest for the Israelites under God's protection. The Israelites gathered together under the starry sky, feeling the peace and reassurance that God was always near. Moses knelt in prayer with the Israelites. Lord, you are the source of life. Please continue to guide us through the challenges ahead. The light from the lamp spread around, bringing warmth and light to all who walked the path of the Lord. The Israelites continued on, their hearts filled with peace and faith in God's guidance. They felt His unconditional love. Moses watched over and guided the Israelites with each step. He knew that every decision he made would impact the future of the nation. Moses stood on the hilltop, looking towards the promised land. He knew the future of the Israelites would be bright, though the road ahead would be difficult. The Israelites looked ahead, hopeful for a bright future. They felt God's presence in every step they took. The light from God continued to shine, bringing life and blessings to the land the Israelites would soon occupy. The Israelites sang together, their hearts full of gratitude for God's guidance and protection. Moses looked back, a satisfied smile on his face. He knew that, though the journey was long, they were not alone. The Israelites continued their journey, each step steady and sure. They were heading toward the promised land, with faith in the future. Moses led the Israelites into a new day, a day of hope and change. God had, and would always, be with them. Finally, the promised land appeared before them, a clear sign of God's promise to the Israelites. The Israelites stood, moved by the beauty before them. They knew every hardship had been worth it. Moses looked back at the Israelites one last time, feeling a sense of fulfillment in his heart. He had led them closer to God's promise. Moses turned back, looking toward the promised land, with faith that even though he could not enter, the Israelites would be led in by God. The Israelites continued to walk, hearts filled with hope. They knew this was just the beginning of a new journey, full of blessings. Moses led the Israelites into a new land where they would build a new future, a new life under God's protection. As the dawn rose, its radiant light shone upon the Israelites, giving them renewed strength and faith. Moses, with the Israelites, knelt down in gratitude, thanking God for leading them through the trials and giving them a new opportunity. The Israelites continued their journey with unwavering faith. They knew that no matter how many challenges lay ahead, God would always be with them. Moses looked ahead, smiling faintly. He knew that, though the journey was hard, they were getting closer to freedom and peace. Moses turned back one last time, looking at the Israelites walking with unwavering determination and faith. He felt at peace. The Israelites stepped into the promised land, the land God had promised them. They felt overwhelmed with emotion and infinite gratitude. Moses knelt before God, giving thanks for leading the Israelites to this safe place. A new chapter was beginning. The Israelites began to set up their tents, building a new life under God's protection and guidance. A fresh start for this nation. As the sun set over the promised land, its warm light shone down, a sign of peace, hope, and God's promise. The Israelites sang together, their hearts filled with thanksgiving for all that God had done for them. Moses stood, smiling contentedly. He knew the long journey had been worth it, and the Israelites would live in God's blessings. The Israelites looked towards the future, with hope and trust in God's guidance. A bright future awaited them. The Israelites made a vow together, pledging their loyalty to God, promising to live by His word and maintain a strong bond with Him. Moses looked up to the heavens, praying, thanking God for guiding the Israelites through every trial. And now they had a bright future ahead. The Israelites began to build a new life, planting crops and constructing the first homes in the Promised Land. Moses continued to lead the Israelites, teaching them how to live according to God's truth and commandments. The Israelites prayed, thankful for the blessings God had given them, and asking Him to continue guiding them. The dawn's light shone over the Promised Land, symbolizing rebirth and eternal hope. Moses and the Israelites gathered together, feeling the unity and the presence of God in every step they took. Moses handed over the leadership to Joshua, passing on the faith and courage he had received from God. Moses looked to the future, handing over authority to Joshua to continue God's work, knowing that God's guidance would still be with them. The Israelites began to build the temple, where it would serve as the center of worship and God's presence among them. As the temple was completed, a light from heaven shone down, confirming that God had chosen this place as His dwelling. The Israelites stood in reverence in the temple, feeling God's holy presence, and a deep sense of peace filled their hearts. Moses knelt down, thanking God once again for guiding him and the Israelites through every hardship and for His promises. Moses walked alone up the mountain to meet God, concluding a long journey and fulfilling the mission God had entrusted him with. The Israelites continued their journey, carrying God's promises and a strong faith in a future full of hope. The Israelites stopped, looking up to the heavens, feeling God's presence still guiding them. The Israelites continued walking, their hearts full of hope. They knew their journey would continue, but God would always be with them. The Israelites stood together, looking ahead, knowing that a new life awaited them. They were a chosen people of God. The sun set on the Promised Land, marking the end of one day and the beginning of a new chapter for the Israelites. The Israelites took their steps forward, confident in the future, always remembering that God was guiding them. The Israelites sat down, facing new challenges. They realized that the Promised Land was not an easy paradise. Moses and Joshua conversed, acknowledging that although the new life brought many challenges, they still needed patience and faith. The Israelites worked hard, planting and building, but they also felt weary from the constant challenges. Some of the Israelites began to argue over the distribution of resources and land. They couldn't avoid disagreements. Moses stood in neutrality, listening and trying to calm the disputes. He knew that peace within the community was essential. Moses assigned the elders and tribal leaders the task of resolving the disputes, restoring unity. Moses advised the Israelites, "Remember that we are a chosen people, and living together in harmony is key to receiving God's protection." The Israelites listened together to Moses, and they began resolving their disputes, rebuilding trust in each other and in God. The Israelites paused, reflecting on God's guidance. They remembered the times God had helped and led them. Joshua prepared to face new challenges. He knew his task wasn't just leading the army, but also strengthening the faith of the Israelites. The Israelites sought comfort from God in times of difficulty. They prayed, remembering His promises. Moses continued to lead, encouraging the Israelites to live by God's word and maintain unity within the community. The Israelites prepared for a new battle to defend their land. They knew that the next challenge would come. The Israelites trusted in God's protection, and they moved forward with faith and hope. The Israelites looked toward the future with firm belief that they would always be guided by God, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Joshua stood, ready to lead the Israelites into the next challenges, with a heart full of resolve and faith in God. The Israelites continued their journey, hand in hand, united in faith in God and looking toward a bright future. Light shone upon the Israelites as a sign of God's presence, guiding them into the future. Before going to battle, the Israelites prayed, asking God to protect them and lead them to victory. Moses and Joshua knelt down together, praying for wisdom and strength from God to lead the Israelites in the coming battle. The Israelites went to battle, resolute, certain that God's protection would always be with them. The battle began, and the Israelites faced their enemies with courage, knowing that God would lead them to victory. The Israelites continued to fight, believing that every victory was a proof of God's protection and guidance. The sunlight shone down on the battlefield like a sign of God's presence, bringing hope to the Israelites. As the battle raged on, Moses prayed, asking God to keep the hand of victory strong for the Israelites. Joshua stood firm, leading the army with courage, trusting in God's guidance. The Israelites sensed victory was near as they saw the enemy begin to retreat. The enemy began to retreat, and the Israelites cheered in victory, sensing God's greatness in the battle. Moses continued praying, feeling God's presence in every moment of this victory. The Israelites gathered around Moses, praising and thanking God for the victory he had given them. Moses thanked God, saying that it was all through his guidance and strength that the Israelites could win. The Israelites looked up to the sky, praying to thank God and asking him to continue protecting them on the path ahead. Moses and the Israelites built an altar together to show gratitude and offer thanksgiving to God. The altar was lit, and light radiated from it as a sign of God's presence, dispelling the darkness of the war. The Israelites rested after the victory, feeling peace and hope for the future, knowing that God was always with them. Joshua continued preparing for the next challenges, knowing that they would have to fight even more to protect the promised land. The Israelites looked up to the sky, praying for God to continue protecting them and guiding them through the upcoming trials. The Israelites walked together in unity, knowing that only through unity could they overcome the challenges ahead. Moses and Joshua gave instructions to the Israelites together, guiding them in every step of their long journey. The Israelites shared bread and food in peace, understanding that only unity and faith in God could sustain their community. Moses spoke words of encouragement, reminding the Israelites that the road ahead was long, but they must always be steadfast in faith. The Israelites were determined to move forward, each step a firm one in faith, trusting in God's guidance. Though challenges lay ahead, the light from the altar still shone, as a sign to the Israelites that God would always lead them. The Israelites prepared to enter a new phase of life, full of challenges, but also full of hope in God's protection. Moses and the Israelites prayed together in unity, asking God to continue guiding them and giving them strength to overcome every trial. The Israelites moved toward the promised land, knowing that though the journey was filled with hardships, God's guidance would always be their light. The Israelites began to set up their tents again, preparing for a new life, even though many challenges lay ahead. The Israelites worked together, helping one another with the heavy tasks, supporting each other through the struggles. Moses continued to lead, making important decisions for the future of the Israelites, always praying and seeking God's guidance. Moses shared God's word with the Israelites, reminding them of faithfulness and perseverance in this long journey. The Israelites were ready to face the next challenge, full of hope that God's protection would continue to be with them. Moses led the Israelites into a new land where they would start a new life, even though the road ahead was still difficult. The Israelites began to build new cities, hoping that they would grow and prosper in the promised land. Moses and the Israelites knelt down together in prayer, thanking God for the guidance and protection He had given them throughout their journey. The Israelites continued to nurture their faith in God, believing that every challenge would be overcome if they held on to their faith. The Israelites lived in peace and joy, enjoying days of tranquility, with firm faith in God's protection. The Israelites looked up to the sky, feeling God's presence always by their side, guiding and protecting them every step of the way. Moses prepared for a long life in the Promised Land, teaching the Israelites about faithfulness and gratitude toward God. The Israelites sang songs of praise to God, expressing gratitude for His protection and unconditional love. Moses stood looking at the Israelites, feeling joy that his people had come out of slavery and were moving toward a bright future. The Israelites listened to Moses, realizing that his leadership was the tool God had used to help them overcome all challenges. The Israelites prepared to enter a new era where they would live according to God's teachings and build a strong nation. Moses spoke his final words to the Israelites, urging them to hold firm in faith and remain faithful to God. The Israelites prepared for new challenges. With Moses' leadership and faith in God, they were ready to face any hardship. The Israelites moved toward a hopeful future, with hearts full of trust in God and the teachings of Moses. The Israelites walked in faith and hope, knowing that God would always guide them, no matter how difficult the path ahead. The Israelites moved forward in faith, each step a step of trust in God's guidance. Moses and the Israelites lived in peace and unity, knowing that only together could they overcome every challenge. Moses looked up to the sky, praying that God's guidance would always be with the Israelites. The Israelites looked ahead, trusting that God would continue to lead them through every trial. The Israelites looked toward the horizon, with hope for a bright future, always trusting in God's guidance. The Israelites walked steadfastly, knowing that although the road ahead was tough, God's guidance was certain and unchanging. Thank you for watching this inspiring story. Leave your thoughts in the comments below about the lessons you've learned from Moses and the Israelites' journey. Don't forget to hit like if you found this story meaningful, and subscribe so you won't miss out on other engaging Bible stories. Share this video with your friends and family so you can explore more valuable lessons from the Bible together. And don't forget to check out our next video about Joshua and the conquest of the Promised Land. See you in the next video. Thank you for joining us. Stay steadfast in your faith, and remember that God is always with you through every trial.